Donald Trump wants to bring down the value of the dollar. His top trade advisor, Robert Liser, has put the idea into his head, and if he wins the election, everything indicates that it may be one of his star measures. But who is Robert Liser, and why has he convinced Trump to blow up the US currency? What would be the consequences for the global economy? What role would China play in this whole story? Today on Visualeconomik, we tell you all about it. Robert Liser is the shadowy figure who has directed US trade policy for nearly a decade. He was born just after World War II in Ashtabula, Ohio. He studied law and dedicated his life to protecting the steel industry in political circles. Indeed, we are talking about a steel lobbyist, a political juggler friend of Donald Trump, who, when Trump became president, was appointed US trade representative. These days, Trump has a reputation as a protectionist. He raised steel tariffs by 25%, tightened the free trade agreement with Mexico, and started the trade war with China. But in reality, the brains behind these moves was today's protagonist, Robert Liser. A few years have passed since then, and today, Robert is one of Donald Trump's main campaign advisors. If he wins the election, everything points to him being appointed as the new Secretary of the US Treasury. Now, does that mean Trump will continue his protectionist escalation? Well, not only will it continue, but it will intensify. The Republican leader has already announced that he will impose a 10% tariff on all countries, 60% on China, and more specifically, 200% on its cars. So if you want to buy an A-Ways, a BYD, or an MG4, be prepared to pay double in tariffs for what the car itself costs. But that's not the worst of it. Robert Liser wants to go further. For him, tariffs are not enough, and he has already convinced the former president of a new, even more groundbreaking plan: devaluation of the dollar. Devaluing a currency is something we have heard about a lot in poor countries. After all, it's a practice that consists of making a currency weaker. But in the USA? Come on, if there is one thing the Yankees are known for, it's having the strongest currency in the world. Why would Trump want to devalue it? Well, here, the first thing we have to do is ask another question. What does it mean for a currency to be strong? Well, normally, people associate the strength of a currency with their country's economy being prosperous. But in reality, that has nothing to do with it. For example, Japan is the third largest economy in the world, but the yen has not stopped losing value over the last 10 years. In reality, when we say that a currency is strong or weak, we are referring to the amount of things you can buy in foreign countries relative to the prices in your country. Think of it this way: the US dollar has an exchange rate close to 1 against the euro. In other words, $1 is exchanged for €1. The logical thing would be that, being equivalent, both currencies could buy the same amount of things in their respective countries. But what happens in reality? Well, prices in Europe are much lower. If we go to Spain with $1, we would buy many more products than what the same dollar would buy in New York. In other words, the dollar is worth more abroad than at home. That is why we say that the dollar is a strong currency. But why is it so valuable? Well, largely because it's a safe and reliable store of value. Many of those who buy dollars do so not because of its purchasing power, but because it's such a stable and safe currency that it is ideal for protecting their savings. The dollar is the world's main reserve currency. It accounts for nearly 60% of the reserves of all countries' central banks. Now, don't think that dollars are kept in safes. In reality, what is kept are US Treasury bonds, which, when there are problems, are converted into dollars. The point is that we aren't just talking about central banks. Companies, financial institutions, and individuals around the world have increasingly been hoarding US bonds to protect themselves from emerging dangers, such as pandemics or wars in the Middle East. As the demand for bonds increased, so did the demand for dollars used to buy these bonds. And the more dollars are in demand means an increase in their price and an even stronger dollar. To which you may say, so what's the problem? The problem is that a strong dollar implies the weakness of the rest of the currencies. In other words, just as it's very cheap for an American to go to Europe with his or her dollars, it's very expensive for a European to go to the United States with weak euros. This explains why the American nation is in constant trade deficit, exporting much less than it imports. Its industrial sector is finding it very difficult to sell its products in international markets, while Americans, with strong dollars, are finding it increasingly cheaper to buy foreign products, such as those from China. And you can see where this is going, can't you? Robert Liser has been a lobbyist for American industry industry most of his life. An industry threatened by China that he can now protect by collapsing the value of the dollar. The idea is music to Trump's ears. First, because it would benefit rural export-oriented areas, which is where his biggest voting base is. Second, because it would hurt China by making it more expensive to buy its products with a weaker dollar. And third, because he could sell an increase in exports as a political success. Sounds good, doesn't it? Well, no, it's a terrible idea, and we'll see why in a moment. For the moment, another question needs to be answered first. Is it really feasible that Donald Trump, as much as he might want to, could collapse the value of the dollar? In what ways could he do so? The first way to devalue a currency is to reduce interest rates. That would reduce the attractiveness of investing in US Treasury bonds. Many investors would stop investing in the country to invest elsewhere. The demand for dollars would fall, and therefore their price would also decrease. The problem, for one thing, it's not certain that this will work. Historically, interest rates in the rest of the world have followed US rates. In other words, if Trump lowers interest rates, the rest of the countries could follow in his footsteps. It will no longer be as profitable for investors to move money out of the United States, and everything will remain the same. But on the other hand, rates are lowered by printing banknotes, which means that, yes, maybe the dollar is cheaper, but the resulting inflation could boost the costs of industry, and in the end, serve no purpose. And what can I say, maybe at some other point in time, but right now the last thing the US needs is another inflationary episode. But even given those options, Trump wouldn't even have the power to lower rates. Interest rates are up to the Fed, not the government.
Trump pushes Fed to lower interest rates. Trump heaps pressure on Fed and its chairman Powell to cut rates.
Rest assured that if Trump returns to the White House, he will do everything possible to put the Fed at his service. But most likely, if he wants to devalue, he will have to find another method. What if I told you that there is a way to lower interest rates without the Fed doing anything? It's called austerity. Good old-fashioned savings. If families, companies, or the US government start saving, banks will have so much money that they will be able to lend it very cheaply. In other words, they will lower rates without having to print banknotes. And let's see, there is room for improvement here. Right now, the United States is one of the countries that saves the least in the world. In fact, its savings rate has done nothing but plummet. The question is, how do you force an entire country to save big? Well, unless you keep taxes low and save it for them, I don't think that overnight Yankees are going to fatten their bank accounts. And what can I say? Raising taxes doesn't look like a very favorable electoral option for Trump either. Do you remember that we said that the dollar is expensive because all countries accumulate it in reserves in their central banks? Think about it. If Trump forces these countries to get rid of those reserves, problem solved. This is the most feasible solution of all. So feasible is it, in fact, that it was already implemented 40 years ago. The year was 1985. Ronald Reagan presided over the White House. Rising oil prices and high interest rates following the crisis of the 1970s caused the dollar to appreciate 50% against the rest of the world's currencies. At that time, Japan was at its technological peak, threatening to overtake the US, and a large alliance of US manufacturers, including IBM, Motorola, and Caterpillar, began an intense campaign demanding state protection from the Japanese threat. Just as Donald Trump wants to do with China, Reagan bowed to pressure. His goal, devalue the dollar by forcing the rest of the countries to sell their reserves. The United States threatened the other powers with harsh tariffs if they did not yield to its plans. And so, in September of the same year, the agreements were concluded. After that, countries such as Japan began selling their reserves. Everything pointed to the dollar weakening and the Yankees regaining their industrial power. The problem? Well, it didn't turn out as expected. Quite the contrary. The first 2 years following the agreements, the US trade deficit worsened. In other words, it exported even less than before in relation to imports. So what went wrong, you may ask? Well, it's true that Japan agreed to devalue the dollar, but to counteract the effect, it applied import restrictions at the same time. One move to balance the other, and everything basically remained the same. Generally speaking, no matter how much Trump would now force the rest of the world to sell its reserves, they could always find alternative strategies to compensate. Besides, what can I say? For the strategy to work, China would have to cooperate. And what does Trump intend to use to convince Xi Jinping? Threats to tariffs? Tariffs that he is going to impose anyway? But even if he did, it is not even clear that this would have any effect. In 2015, and for other reasons, China already sold a significant chunk of its reserves, and that did not alter the value of the dollar at all. Keep in mind that, at the end of the day, the dollar not only depends on the reserves of central banks, it also depends on the demand of companies and individuals who use it to trade or save. The private sector in this case could compensate for what the public sector does. Now, do you know what could be even worse? That this strategy would work. If all countries start selling reserves, which, let's remember, are US Treasury bonds, those bonds will lose value as their supply skyrockets. And it turns out that since the Silicon Valley Bank crisis, US banks have been on the ropes, with a lot of loss-making bonds on their balance sheets. If the value of these bonds declines further, it could trigger a banking panic. As you can see, lowering the value of the dollar is no easy task, but if it were to be achieved, would it really be worth it? Does the end justify the means? Well, not only would it not be worth it, but it would surely be a harebrained scheme that would severely damage the US economy and even political power against Russia. A cheap dollar would decrease the purchasing power of Americans. True, they would be able to export more, but with a weaker currency, they would have to spend more money on foreign goods. In other words, there would be more inflation and loss of savings. This in turn includes the industrial sector itself. They would sell more, but they would also have to pay more for supplies, which in reality doesn't make it very clear that it would benefit them at all. And in political terms, well, nothing prevents China from responding with another devaluation of its own to offset the dollar's devaluation. It would be like entering into a childish exchange, which would only provoke instability and loss of confidence in the dollar. And take note, because this is important. If Trump starts manipulating the dollar, it may lose its prestige as a reserve currency. Things may start to get out of control. Countries may stop wanting to reserve as many dollars, and that could unleash a domino effect of distrust. The result would be that Uncle Sam's political power would collapse. For what reason? Because reserves play a fundamental role in the application of sanctions. The US can freeze the reserves of all countries that do not cooperate with its sanctioning scheme, or that it considers enemies. In other words, the same thing that happened with Russia a few years ago. In any case, Visualeconomik community, and in view of all this, the question is over to you. Do you think Donald Trump will succeed in devaluing the dollar if he wins the election? What would be the consequences? What would be his method of doing so? You could leave your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week. Please give the video a like if you liked the video, and subscribe so you don't miss any of the future ones. All the best, see you soon.